This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Czech Chris, London, UK. Nicholas Nickleby, by Charles Dickens. Chapter 14. Having the misfortune to treat of none but common people is necessarily of a mean and vulgar character. In that quarter of London in which Golden Square is situated, there is a bygone, faded, tumble-down street, with two irregular rows of tall, meagre houses, which seem to have stared each other out of countenance years ago. The very chimneys appear to have grown dismal and melancholy, from having had nothing better to look at than the chimneys over the way. Their tops are battered and broken and blackened with smoke, and here and there some taller stack than the rest, inclining heavily to one side and toppling over the roof, seems to meditate taking revenge for half a century's neglect by crushing the inhabitants of the garrets beneath. The fowls who peck about the kennels, jerking their bodies hither and thither with a gait which none but town fowls are ever seen to adopt, and which any country cock or hen would be puzzled to understand, are perfectly in keeping with the crazy habitations of their owners. Dingy, ill-plumed, drowsy flutterers, sent, like many of the neighbouring children, to get a livelihood in the streets, they hop from stone to stone in forlorn search of some hidden eatable in the mud, and can scarcely raise a crow among them. The only one with anything approaching to a voice is an aged bantam at the baker's, and even he is hoarse in consequence of bad living in his last place. To judge from the size of the houses, they have been at one time tenanted by persons of better condition than their present occupants, but they are now let off by the week in floors or rooms, and every door has almost as many plates or bell handles as there are apartments within. The windows are, for the same reason, sufficiently diversified in appearance, being ornamented with every variety of common blind and curtain that can easily be imagined, while every doorway is blocked up and rendered nearly impassable by a motley collection of children and porter-pots of all sizes, from the baby in arms and the half-pint pot, to the full-grown girl and half-gallon can. In the parlour of one of these houses, which was perhaps a thought dirtier than any of its neighbours, which exhibited more bell-handles, children, and porter-pots, and caught in all its freshness the first gust of the thick black smoke that poured forth night and day from a large brewery hard by, hung a bill announcing that there was yet one room to let within its walls, though on what story the vacant room could be, regard being had to the outward tokens of many lodgers which the whole front displayed, from the mangle in the kitchen window to the flower pots on the parapet, it would have been beyond the power of a calculating boy to discover. The common stairs of this mansion were bare and carpetless, but a curious visitor who had to climb his way to the top might have observed that there were not wanting indications of the progressive poverty of the inmates, although their rooms were shut. Thus the first-floor lodgers, being flush of furniture, kept an old mahogany table, real mahogany, on the landing-place outside, which was only taken in when occasion required. On the second story, the spare furniture dwindled down to a couple of old deal chairs, of which one, belonging to the back room, was shorn of a leg and bottomless. The story above boasted no greater excess than a worm-eaten wash-tub, and the garret landing-place displayed no costlier articles than two crippled pitchers and some broken blacking bottles. It was on this garret landing-place that a hard-featured, square-faced man, elderly and shabby, stopped to unlock the door of the front attic, into which, having surmounted the task of turning the rusty key in its still more rusty wards, he walked with the air of legal owner. This person wore a wig of short, coarse, red hair, which he took off with his hat and hung upon a nail. Having adopted in its place a dirty cotton nightcap, and groped about in the dark till he found a remnant of candle, he knocked at the partition which divided the two garrets, and inquired in a loud voice whether Mr. Noggs had a light. The sounds that came back were stifled by the lat and plaster, and it seemed, moreover, as though the speaker had uttered them from the interior of a mug, or other drinking vessel. but they were in the voice of Newman, and conveyed a reply in the affirmative. "A nasty night, Mr. Noggs," said the man in the nightcap, stepping in to light his candle. "Does it rain?" asked Newman. "Does it?" replied the other, pettishly. "I'm wet through." "It doesn't take much to wet you and me through, Mr. Crowl," said Newman, laying his hand upon the lapel of his threadbare coat. "Well, and that makes it the more vexatious," observed Mr. Crowl in the same pettish tone. Uttering a low, querulous growl, the speaker, whose harsh countenance was the very epitome of selfishness, raked the scanty fire nearly out of the grate, and, emptying the glass which Noggs had pushed towards him, inquired where he kept his coals. Newman Noggs pointed to the bottom of a cupboard, and Mr. Crowl, seizing the shovel, threw on half the stock, which Noggs very deliberately took off again without saying a word. "You've not turned saving at this time of day, I hope?" said Crowl. Newman pointed to the empty glass, as though it were a sufficient refutation of the charge, and briefly said that he was going downstairs to supper. "To the Kenwigses?" asked Crowl. Newman nodded assent. "Think of that now," said Crowl. "If I didn't, thinking that you were certain not to go, because you said you wouldn't, tell Kenwigs I couldn't come, and make up my mind to spend the evening with you." "I was obliged to go," said Newman. "They would have me." "Well, but what's to become of me?" urged the selfish man, who never thought of anybody else. "It's all your fault. I'll tell you what, I'll sit by your fire till you come back again." Newman cast a despairing glance at his small store of fuel, but not having the courage to say no, a word which in all his life he never had said at the right time, either to himself or anyone else, gave way to the proposed arrangement. Mr. Crowl immediately went about making himself as comfortable with Newman Noggs's means as circumstances would admit of his being made. The lodgers to whom Crowl had made allusion under the designation of the Kenwigses were the wife and olive branches of one Mr. Kenwigs, a turner in ivory, who was looked upon as a person of some consideration on the premises, inasmuch as he occupied the whole of the first floor, comprising a suite of 2 rooms. Mrs. Kenwigs, too, was quite a lady in her manners, and of a very genteel family, having an uncle who collected a water rate, besides which distinction, the 2 eldest of her little girls went twice a week to a dancing school in the neighbourhood, and had flaxen hair tied with blue ribbons hanging in luxuriant pigtails down their backs, and wore little white trousers with frills round the ankles, for all of which reasons, and many more equally valid but too numerous to mention, Mrs. Kenwigs was considered a very desirable person to know, and was the constant theme of all the gossips in the street, and even 3 or 4 doors round the corner at both ends. It was the anniversary of that happy day on which the Church of England, as by law established, had bestowed Mrs. Kenwigs upon Mr. Kenwigs, and in grateful commemoration of the same, Mrs. Kenwigs had invited a few select friends to cards and a supper in the first floor, and had put on a new gown to receive them in, which gown, being of a flaming colour, and made upon a juvenile principle, was so successful that Mr. Kenwigs said the 8 years of matrimony and the 5 children seemed all a dream, and Mrs. Kenwigs younger and more blooming than on the very first Sunday he had kept company with her. Beautiful as Mrs. Kenwigs looked when she was dressed, though, and so stately that you would have supposed she had a cook and housemaid at least, and nothing to do but order them about, she had a world of trouble with the preparations; more, indeed, than she, being of a delicate and genteel constitution, could have sustained, had not the pride of housewifery upheld her. At last, however, all the things that had to be got together were got together, and all the things that had to be got out of the way were got out of the way, and everything was ready, and the collector himself having promised to come, fortune smiled upon the occasion. The party was admirably selected. There were, first of all, Mr. Kenwigs and Mrs. Kenwigs, and 4 Olive Kenwigses who sat up to supper, firstly, because it was but right that they should have a treat on such a day, and secondly, because their going to bed in presence of the company would have been inconvenient, not to say improper. Then, there was a young lady who had made Mrs. Kenwigs's dress,